Ambrogino Calabresi was the most feared man in Chicago, a shadow king who could sign a death warrant with a single cold stare. But the one secret that could topple his empire was the absolute silence he had lived in since birth. Welcome to Favy Love Stories. Like and hit the subscribe button now, because there are many more stories like this coming your way. Tune in for more danger, desire, and unforgettable tales. Now let's begin. For decades, the underworld called him the Ghost, a man so disciplined he never missed a whisper or a threat. In reality, Ambrogino was a man drowning in a world without sound, hiding his deafness behind a mask of terrifying composure. He believed he was destined to be alone, until a sweltering Monday night and a maid named Nicole. Risking a shallow grave for stepping out of line, she didn't just clear a plate. She reached into her apron and pulled out a small, pulsing black device that would do more than just save his life. It would break the ice around his heart. As the Chicago rain blurred the city into charcoal and gold, a silent king finally felt the rhythm of another soul, changing the fate of the Calabresi family and the meaning of power forever. Ambrogino Calabresi sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, a king encased in a tomb of his own making. To the men surrounding him, vultures in silk ties and tailored wool, he was the ghost of Chicago, a man so cold and calculating that he didn't need to speak to command the room. In reality, he was drowning in a sea of absolute, suffocating silence. The air in the private dining room was thick with the scent of aged bourbon and expensive tobacco, but for Ambrogino, the only sensory input was the vibration of the heavy rain against the windows and the rhythmic, aggressive movement of lips across the table. He watched Carmine, an underboss from the South Side, lean back with a predatory grin. Ambrogino's eyes, sharpened by decades of necessity, tracked every syllable. He was a master of the craft, but tonight, the exhaustion was a physical weight behind his ribs. Lip-reading was an unending marathon of mental gymnastics, a constant puzzle where one missed shadow on a speaker's mouth could mean the difference between a merger and a massacre. Carmine was speaking too fast, his mouth a blur of jagged motions, and Ambrogino felt the familiar, cold prickle of sweat at his hairline. He couldn't hear the snickers that surely followed Carmine's hidden barbs, but he could feel the atmosphere shift. The energy in the room was sharp, jagged, and mocking. He was a lion who knew the hyenas were laughing, even if he couldn't hear the sound of their breath. His world was a glass wall, transparent enough to see the danger, but thick enough to keep him eternally isolated. He tightened his grip on his crystal glass, watching the way the amber liquid trembled. Every movement in the room felt like a personal affront, the way a bodyguard shifted his weight, the way a rival tapped a ring against a saucer. It was a symphony of motion he was forced to conduct without an orchestra. He felt the eyes of his brother-in-law, Rico, drilling into the side of his head. Rico knew, or he suspected, and in this world, suspicion was a death sentence. Into this pressure cooker stepped Nicole. She moved through the room with a quiet, practiced invisibility, a tray of crystal carafes balanced on her arm. While the other staff kept their heads down, terrified of catching a stray bullet from a glance, Nicole did something different. She watched. She saw the way Ambrogino's jaw was locked so tight the muscle pulsed. She saw the subtle, frantic darting of his pupils as he tried to keep up with the 3 different conversations happening at once. She recognized the look of a man who was fighting a war in total darkness. As she approached the head of the table, she didn't just see a boss. She saw a man whose silence was a scream for help. She paused just behind his shoulder, the warmth of her presence a sudden, startling contrast to the icy vacuum of his world. The tension in the dining room had reached a fever pitch, a jagged frequency that Nicole could feel in the very marrow of her bones. While the men around the table played their lethal games of posture and subtext, she focused on the predator seated directly across from Ambrogino. It was Rico, the brother-in-law with a smile like a razor blade. He was leaning forward, his lips moving in a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that he knew Ambrogino couldn't catch, a deliberate sonic camouflage. Beneath the table, Rico's foot was tapping a frantic, coded signal against the floorboards, a vibration that Nicole recognized from her years of studying acoustic patterns. It wasn't just a nervous habit, it was a countdown. Ambrogino remained a statue of charcoal silk, his eyes fixed on Rico's mouth with an intensity that bordered on agony. He was searching for the shape of the betrayal, but the low lighting and Rico's calculated mumble were winning. Nicole saw the micro-tremor in Ambrogino's jaw. He was blind in a room full of knives. Risking the immediate wrath of the bodyguards, Nicole stepped out of the shadows. She didn't offer wine or water. She moved with a silent, feline grace, her hand dipping into her apron to retrieve the small, haptic transducer, the heartbeat of her secret world. As she leaned over to clear a glass that didn't need clearing, her arm brushed against Ambrogino's. The contact was electric, a jolt of heat that made him stiffen, his hand instinctively twitching toward the holster beneath his jacket. But before he could react, Nicole slid her hand over his, her palm pressing the cold, black disc firmly into his center. She didn't pull away. Instead, she laced her fingers through his in a mimicry of a lover's caress, pinning the device between their flesh. Suddenly, the vacuum of Ambrogino's world vanished. A sharp, rhythmic pulsing erupted in his palm, translating the hidden mumble across the table into a terrifying clarity of sensation. Through the haptic link, Rico's voice wasn't a sound, but a series of staccato thumps against his nerves. Now, the vibration whispered through his skin. Take him now! Ambrogino's breath hitched. For the first time in 30 years, the silence hadn't just been broken, it had been weaponized. He felt the warmth of Nicole's hand, the steady, grounding rhythm of her own heart beneath the device, and the warning she had just gifted him. His dark eyes shifted from Rico to the woman standing over him. In that shared pulse, the power dynamic of the Chicago underworld shifted on its axis. He didn't pull his hand away. He gripped hers tighter, a silent, desperate acknowledgement of the woman who had just given a ghost his ears. He wasn't a victim of his silence anymore. He was a hunter who had finally found his frequency. The golden handcuffs of the Calabresi Empire were far more comfortable than Nicole had imagined, yet they felt twice as heavy. Within 24 hours of the dinner, her threadbare uniform had been replaced by high thread count linens, and her life had been relocated to the fortified sanctuary of the estate's east wing. Ambrogino's private quarters were a tomb of marble and silence, devoid of the ticking clocks or humming televisions that filled normal homes. He paced the length of the room like a caged panther, his presence radiating a jagged, terrifying energy. To the world, he was the ghost, but in the sterile light of his study, he looked like a man possessed by the sudden, violent intrusion of a new sense. He turned toward Nicole, his eyes burning with a mixture of suspicion and a hunger for understanding that he couldn't name. He didn't know how to ask for what he needed, so he commanded it with a sharp, impatient gesture toward the haptic device sitting on the desk. Nicole didn't flinch. She had seen the way his hands shook when he thought she wasn't looking, the raw vulnerability of a king who had spent his life pretending he didn't have a weakness. She stepped into his personal space, a move that would have earned anyone else a broken rib, and picked up the black disc. She didn't hand it to him. Instead, she took his massive, scarred hand in hers and guided it toward her own body. He froze, his breath hitching as she pressed his palm firmly against the side of her neck, just over her larynx. The intimacy of the gesture was a physical blow. He tried to pull back, his face darkening with a flash of his trademark lethal pride, but Nicole held firm. She locked her gaze onto his, refusing to be intimidated by the man who held her debt and her life in his hands. She began to hum, a low, melodic vibration that traveled from her vocal cords through her skin and directly into his fingertips. Ambrogino's entire body went still. The terrifying mask of the Mafia boss crumbled, replaced by a look of profound, childlike shock. He could feel the resonance of her voice, not as a sound, but as a living, breathing pulse. Seeing the wonder dawning on his face, Nicole let out a soft, genuine laugh. The vibration changed, becoming a rhythmic, dancing staccato against his hand. Ambrogino's eyes widened, his fingers curling instinctively against her throat as he chased the sensation. For the first time, he wasn't just observing a maid, he was experiencing the internal music of another person. The distance between them, once a mile of social standing and silence, vanished. In that quiet room, the most dangerous man in Chicago leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closing as he surrendered to the vibration of her joy. He was no longer just a boss, and she was no longer just a maid. They were two souls finally speaking the same hidden language. The sterile silence of the East Wing began to dissolve, replaced by a secret symphony that only 2 people in the world could hear. As the weeks bled into one another, the haptic device became less of a mechanical tool and more of a bridge between their souls. In the quiet hours when the rest of the estate was asleep and the city lights of Chicago twinkled like fallen stars beyond the glass, Ambrogino and Nicole sat close, their knees brushing, mapping out a new world. They weren't just practicing for the underworld anymore, they were building a sanctuary. Nicole took his hand, her fingers tracing the map of scars and calluses that told the story of his violent rise. She began to teach him the language of us, a dialect of pressure and rhythm that required no sound. A sharp, urgent squeeze of the hand became the signal for danger, a warning that the vultures were circling. A soft, lingering stroke along the back of his knuckles meant patience. But it was the smaller, more intimate signals that made Ambrogino's breath hitch in the dark. Nicole took his thumb and guided it to the hollow of her wrist, pressing it firmly against her radial artery. "This," she signed with her free hand, her eyes soft and luminous, "is I'm here." Every time he felt the steady, thrumming beat of her heart against his thumb, the cold void in his chest seemed to shrink. Ambrogino, a man who had spent a lifetime fearing the vulnerability of touch, found himself craving it. He began to respond, his large hand enveloping hers in a protective weight that whispered stay. He learned that the vibration of her humming against his palm felt like sunlight, and the way her pulse quickened when he leaned in close was the only music he ever wanted to know. The romance bloomed not in words or grand gestures, but in the electricity of a shared frequency. One night, as they sat on the floor surrounded by acoustic diagrams and haptic sensors, Ambrogino reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind Nicole's ear. His fingers lingered on her skin, tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted his fearsome reputation. He didn't need to hear her sigh to know she was falling. He could feel the shift in her resonance, the way her body leaned into his as if seeking a harbor. In the absolute quiet of the penthouse, the ghost of Chicago finally realized that he wasn't broken. He was simply waiting for a partner who knew how to dance to the rhythm of his silence. The heavy, velvet curtains of the Blue Note Jazz Club muffled the chaos of the Chicago streets, but for Ambrogino, the transition was merely from one kind of stillness to another. He felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. The ghost was rarely seen in public without a phalanx of guards, but tonight, the only presence that mattered was Nicole. She looked breathtaking in a dress the color of midnight, her warmth a constant tether as she led him toward a small table near the back of the room, far from the prying eyes of the outfit. As the band took the stage, Nicole didn't point to the instruments or try to describe the melody. Instead, she produced a single, uninflated balloon from her clutch and blew it up, tying the end before placing it between them. She took his hands and guided them onto the thin, taut surface of the latex. Then, she leaned her own chest against the other side. As the upright bass player began a deep, walking groove, the air inside the balloon began to dance. Ambrogino's eyes widened, his fingers curling instinctively around the sphere. He wasn't just perceiving a signal, he was feeling the soul of the music. The low-frequency oscillations of the bass notes thrummed through the balloon, vibrating against his palms and resonating in his chest. It was a symphony of skin, a tactile masterpiece that allowed him to hear the blue notes and the syncopated rhythms through the very pores of his hands. Nicole watched him, her heart swelling at the look of pure, unadulterated wonder on his face. She shifted her position, her lips moving close to the balloon so that when she spoke, the vibration of her voice joined the rhythm of the jazz. The physical intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. In this crowded room, surrounded by the clinking of glasses and the smoke of expensive cigars, they were in a private vacuum of sensation. Ambrogino looked up from the balloon, his gaze locking onto hers. The music reached a crescendo, the drums a frantic, thumping heartbeat that they felt together through the latex bridge. Slowly, Ambrogino reached out, his hand moving from the balloon to cup her cheek. He didn't need a haptic device to feel the heat of her skin or the tremor of her breath. He pulled her closer, letting the balloon fall away until there was nothing between them but the resonance of their own bodies. When his lips finally met hers, the world didn't just go quiet, it exploded in a new frequency. The kiss wasn't just a gesture of affection, it was a rhythmic alignment. He felt the vibration of her soft sigh against his mouth, a melody more beautiful than any song the band could ever play. In the heart of the music, the ghost of Chicago finally understood that he wasn't living in silence. He was living in the rhythm of her love. The warmth of the jazz club was a fading memory, replaced by the sterile, echoing chill of the Calabresi estate. Ambrogino had retired to his inner sanctum, his mind likely still buzzing with the ghost of the music they had shared, but Nicole couldn't settle. She sat on the edge of the bed in her auxiliary room, the haptic transducer resting in her palm like a heavy, obsidian heart. The house felt wrong. The air was too still, yet the floorboards seemed to hold a tension that traveled up through the soles of her feet. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable instinct, she knelt and pressed the device flat against the polished oak floor. At first, there was only the ambient thrum of the building's ventilation, a steady, low-frequency drone. Then, a sharp, rhythmic vibration cut through, the heavy, synchronized footfalls of men who were trying to move without sound. To the naked ear, the house was a tomb, but through the transducer, the floor was a drumskin. Nicole closed her eyes, her fingers tightening on the device as she mapped the movement. These weren't the steady, predictable beats of the regular security detail. These were the frantic, jagged vibrations of predators closing in. The pulses originated from the service stairwell, a path only known to the inner circle. Nicole's breath hitched as she recognized a specific, limping cadence Rico. The betrayal wasn't a distant threat anymore. It was a physical force rising from the basement. Through the haptic link, she could feel the metal-on-metal vibration of a weapon being readied, a high-frequency click that felt like a needle against her skin. She didn't need to hear the words to know that the coup had moved from the shadows to the hallways. Fear threatened to paralyze her, but the memory of Ambrogino's hand in hers, his thumb tracing her pulse, gave her a different kind of frequency. He was currently in his study, likely in total silence, unaware that the air around him was about to be filled with lead. She had to move. She had to be his ears one more time. Gripping the device, Nicole sprinted toward the east wing, her own heart hammering out a frantic code of danger. Tonight, the ghost of Chicago wouldn't be taken in the dark, because the woman he loved was bringing the warning through the very bones of the house. The heavy oak doors of the study hadn't even finished closing behind Nicole when the world plunged into a terrifying, absolute darkness. A surge of high-voltage interference had fried the estate's backup generators, a deliberate move to blind the security cameras and silence the electronic locks. For any other man, the combination of pitch-black shadows and total deafness would have been a death sentence, a double layer of sensory isolation that turned a room into a coffin. But in the center of the darkness, Ambrogino didn't panic. He felt a familiar, calloused hand find his in the void, and then the familiar, grounding pulse of a haptic transducer pressing into his palm. Nicole leaned her back against his, her heart racing but her hand steady. She could feel the vibration of the house through her feet, the subtle, metallic shink of suppressed pistols being readied in the hallway, the heavy, rhythmic thuds of 3 men moving in a tactical diamond formation just outside the door. Through the device, she sent a sharp, double pulse. Danger. Close. Ambrogino adjusted his grip on his own weapon, his body language shifting from a man caught unaware to a predator in his natural habitat. He didn't need to see the hitmen, he only needed to feel Nicole's resonance. The hitmen moved into the room, their night vision goggles casting a ghoulish green glow that Ambrogino couldn't see, but their presence was a series of chaotic vibrations that Nicole filtered and translated. She moved her thumb in a slow, sweeping motion across the sensor, the code for sector sweep. As the first assassin rounded the leather armchair, Nicole gave a sudden, hard squeeze. Ambrogino lunged toward the pressure, his movement a blur of charcoal silk. He didn't fire blindly. He moved toward the source of the vibration Nicole had pinpointed. The hitman barely had time to register a shadow moving in the dark before Ambrogino's strike landed with the weight of a falling mountain. The silence of the room remained unbroken by voice or scream, a ballet of violence conducted in a soundless vacuum. To the invaders, Ambrogino was a ghost, an impossible force that seemed to know exactly where they were despite the darkness. They didn't understand that he wasn't fighting alone. He was connected to a woman who was hearing the very air move around them. As the final hitman retreated toward the door, Nicole felt the floorboards groan under a panicked weight. She pressed her thumb firmly over Ambrogino's pulse point, a long, steady vibration that whispered, "He's running." Now. Ambrogino didn't hesitate. He trusted the frequency of her touch more than he had ever trusted his own eyes. In the midnight silence of the penthouse, the king and the maid were no longer separate entities. They were a single, lethal organism, proving that in a world of darkness, the most powerful light is the one you feel through the skin. Ambrogino stood in the center of the wreckage, the metallic tang of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. 4 years, he had operated with a cold, surgical detachment, viewing his empire as a machine and himself as its silent engine. But as the smoke cleared and he felt the frantic, shallow vibration of Nicole's breathing against his back, the machine broke. In its place was something raw and primeval. He wasn't the ghost of Chicago anymore. He was a man who had finally found something worth hearing, and he would burn the city to the ground before he let that sound be extinguished. Rico stumbled through the threshold, his face a mask of sweating desperation. He clutched a heavy-caliber pistol, his eyes darting frantically around the dark room, trying to find the man who shouldn't have been able to survive an ambush in total silence. Rico began to scream. Insults, threats, justifications, his mouth a jagged, ugly motion in the dim moonlight. To anyone else, the noise would have been deafening. To Ambrogino, it was merely a series of violent, erratic waves traveling through the air, waves that Nicole translated with a sharp, steady pressure against his palm. Through the haptic link, she signaled Rico's position with a thumb press, so precise it felt like a target lock. Ambrogino moved. He didn't wait for Rico to fire. He moved with a ferocity born of a deep, aching love for the woman who had bridged his isolation. He closed the distance in 3 silent strides, his hand shooting out to catch the barrel of Rico's gun. The vibration of the discharge rattled through Ambrogino's bones, a searing heat he ignored as he twisted the weapon from the traitor's grip. He didn't use a gun to finish it. He used the strength of a man who had spent a lifetime building walls, now using those same hands to tear down the man who threatened his sanctuary. Every blow Ambrogino landed was punctuated by a pulse from the device in his other hand, Nicole's heartbeat, steadying him, guiding his rage into a focused, lethal precision. He pinned Rico against the glass wall of the study, the very barrier that had once symbolized Ambrogino's isolation. In the vibration of the glass against his back, Ambrogino could hear Rico's whimpering plea for mercy. He looked back at Nicole, who stood bruised but defiant, her eyes locked onto his. He saw the reflection of the man he had become in her gaze, not a monster, but a protector. With a final, crushing motion, he silenced the betrayal forever. The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't empty or hollow. It was a heavy, sacred quiet. Ambrogino dropped the weapon and turned toward Nicole, reaching out with hands that still trembled from the adrenaline. He didn't need the device to feel her now. He pulled her into his arms, tucking her head under his chin, feeling the rhythmic, beautiful vibration of her sob of relief. He had unleashed the ghost to save the man, and in the ruins of his office, he realized he finally had a world worth listening to. 6 months had passed since the blood-stained night in the penthouse, and the grand ballroom of the Blackstone Hotel was now filled with the heavy, electric silence of the 5 families. The air was thick with skepticism and the scent of expensive cologne. The underworld titans had gathered like vultures, expecting to see a broken king. Instead, the door swung open to reveal Ambrogino Calabresi, standing taller than he had in years. He wasn't hiding behind his bodyguards or masking his eyes. Beside him, dressed in a gown of shimmering gold that matched the fire in her gaze, was Nicole. She didn't walk behind him as a servant. She walked at his side, her fingers laced firmly through his, the haptic device between their palms glowing with a soft, steady blue light. The council of bosses watched in stunned confusion as Ambrogino stepped to the podium. He didn't look for a translator or wait for a whisper. He looked Nicole in the eye, and she gave him a rhythmic, encouraging pulse through the haptic link, the frequency of courage. For the first time in his public life, Ambrogino opened his mouth to speak. His voice was gravelly and unpracticed, the pitch vibrating with the raw effort of a man reclaiming his power, but it carried a weight that made the chandeliers tremble. He didn't speak of war or territory. He spoke of the new frequency of the Calabresi family. As he spoke, Nicole's thumb moved across his palm in a complex, fluid dance, translating the shocked murmurs of the crowd into sensations he could feel. He addressed the weakness they had whispered about, turning it into a threat. He explained that while they relied on what they could hear, he felt the truth of the world through the very bones of the city. To demonstrate, he placed his hand flat on the podium, sensing the micro-vibrations of the room, the shifting weight of a nervous hitman in the back, the quickened heartbeat of a rival boss. He called them out by name, exposing their hidden anxieties with a terrifying, silent precision. The room erupted not in gunfire, but in a standing ovation of reluctant, awestruck respect. They saw a man who had mastered his silence, and a woman who had given him the world. Ambrogino turned away from the microphone, ignoring the roar of the crowd to look only at Nicole. In the vibration of the applause hitting his chest, he leaned down and kissed her, a public declaration that she was no longer the maid who cleaned his floors, but the queen who sat upon his throne. The silence of the ghost of Chicago was no longer a cage, it was a kingdom. He had stopped trying to hear the noise of the world and had finally learned to listen to the rhythm of his own heart and the woman who beat in time with it. Together, they stood at the dawn of a new era, proving that the most powerful voice in the world isn't the one that speaks the loudest, but the one that is felt most deeply. The Moretti legacy was dead. The Calabresi era of the silent king and his golden queen had begun. The end. Why silence nearly killed the Chicago boss. Ambrogino lived in absolute acoustic isolation due to permanent damage to the hair cells in his cochlea or his auditory nerve. In this condition, sound waves simply never reached the brain. To survive, he relied on visual speech mapping or lip reading. However, since only 30% of English is visible on the lips, his brain was in a constant, exhausting state of filling in the blanks to interpret the world. Nicole revolutionized his existence by introducing tactile frequency. While Ambrogino's ears were non-functional, his nervous system could still perceive seismic vibrations, sound energy traveling through solid objects. By using a haptic transducer, Nicole bypassed his damaged ears entirely. The device converted voices into physical pulses felt through the skin, allowing him to hear with his sense of touch. This didn't just fix a defect. It gave Ambrogino a unique tactical advantage, allowing him to perceive his environment through a frequency that no hearing person could ever access. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Your support means the world to us. If this story touched your heart, imagine what's coming next. More passion, more twists, and more unforgettable moments await you. Don't forget to hit the like button. Keep watching for more captivating stories that will leave you breathless. See you in the next tale.